The Democratic primaries are finally here. First up, Iowa and New Hampshire. Why those states? And should we change the system? Welcome back to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. We're just days away from the start of the most anticipated election of 2020, the race between Lincoln the Goat and Sammy the Dog for mayor of Fairhaven, Vermont. Watch out, Lincoln. It's a dog-eat-goat world out there. We're also, of course, just days away from the Iowa caucus, the first actual voting in the 2020 presidential election, which has been going on for the last 262 years. The field is now down to 12 candidates for the Democratic nomination. That's after 16 people have already dropped out. John Hickenlooper, we hardly knew ye. Seriously, I'm still not sure which one you are. But the good news is, we're in the home stretch now, folks. The Iowa caucus happens on February 3rd, followed by the New Hampshire primary on February 11th. Those two states vote almost a month before the biggest group of states do on Super Tuesday, March 3rd. But like in every election cycle, there are people asking, why do Iowa and New Hampshire get to go first anyway? Shouldn't they check their voting privilege? So how did Iowa and New Hampshire become the first states to vote in presidential primaries? Should we change the system? And do early voting states even matter anyway? Now, before we get into this, it's important to remember that although we kind of treat the primaries like a national election, they're not. They're political party nominating processes, where the rules are determined by the Democratic and Republican parties, not the federal government. For example, the Democrats could just as well decide to choose their presidential nominee by locking all the candidates in a house together and making them create TikTok videos for the masses. Whoever trends the most gets the nomination. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but it is an entertaining idea. Also, it's obvious who would win. Actually, pretty much no other country picks their presidential candidates like the US. Political parties in other countries usually have more closed nominating procedures that depend on the preferences of elected officials and other party leaders. So the good thing about the US system is that it gives outsiders or underdog candidates a better chance of winning, which is not as good if you're more part of the establishment. In fact, in the US, we've only had this current system for barely 50 years. It wasn't until the 1970s that the Democratic and Republican parties started giving voters more of a direct say in who gets the party nomination. That happened after Vice President Hubert Humphrey won the nomination at the Democratic Convention despite not having run in 13 primaries. There were huge anti-Vietnam War protests outside the convention that year. Plus, Robert Kennedy had been assassinated that year while running for the Democratic nomination. So yeah, there was a lot going on. As a result of all of this, the Democratic Party instituted reforms that would require more delegates who vote for the party nominee to be directly chosen by voting. And as a result of that, the Iowa Democratic Party had to move their caucus up because, and this is the real reason, they only had one mimeograph machine to copy the paperwork, and they needed a month between each level of voting to handle everything. Here's how Iowa's Democratic Party caucus works. The precinct caucus happens on February 3rd. Iowans go to support their candidates at a local precinct. They literally stand in groups based on which candidate they support, like they're choosing teams for kickball. But if your kickball team isn't big enough, that's a problem. So, if a candidate does not get at least 15% of the vote, then that means their supporters have to pick another candidate to support. And that goes on until all the voters have chosen. So being someone's second or third choice in Iowa can be pretty important. So is persuading other people to join your team if theirs doesn't work out. The process can take up to 4 hours. This is why caucuses generally appeal to the most engaged voters. Now technically, February 3rd is just the first Iowa caucus. They repeat this process at the county, district, and state level until the final delegates for the Democratic Convention are chosen. Back in 1972, they needed a month between each caucus so they could get organized with their one mimeograph machine. So that's how Iowa became the state that went first. But how did Iowa become so important? According to this video from the New York Times, that big change was during the 1972 Democratic primary between George McGovern and Eddie Muskie, and it was because of an intrepid reporter from the New York Times.
Apple's article helped swing the national spotlight onto the caucuses. He's got quite the story to tell. Muskie's won, but just barely. Not the runaway win people were expecting. And McGovern comes in a strong second. No one expected that either. The Reform Caucus rules helped a long-shot candidate rise to the top.
That underdog story attracted national media attention. McGovern went on to win the Democratic nomination, but lost the election. Then in 1976, underdog Jimmy Carter did the same thing. He unexpectedly finished second in the Iowa caucus after campaigning hard in the state and getting national media attention and a boost to his campaign. He won the Democratic nomination and the presidential election. And in 1980, Republican George H.W. Bush did a similar thing. He campaigned hard in Iowa and won the Iowa caucus against the more well-known Ronald Reagan. Bush later lost the nomination to Reagan, but became his vice president. So the Iowa caucus became a place where the underdog could win and change the narrative of a race. And the media loves it, like when Obama unexpectedly won the caucus back in 2008. New Hampshire, meanwhile, has had the first primary in the nation since the 1920s, although it didn't really matter back then since they were only voting for local delegates for the convention and not actually for the presidential candidate. It didn't really become a big deal until around the same time that Iowa did. Now, New Hampshire has the first primary according to its own state law. There might be different winners in Iowa versus New Hampshire, but it's rare for someone to lose both and still win the party nomination. The two states both have small populations that lend themselves to what's called retail politics. That is, candidates actually going to campaign in person, holding rallies, town halls, and going to diners to meet voters, instead of just relying on political ads and media appearances. So you could argue that in these states, the voters get to see the candidates in person and have their concerns directly answered instead of relying on mass media so they can make more informed choices. But these states are also less diverse than the rest of the country, which has led to increasing criticism among Democrats.
What I really appreciate about Iowans and the folks in New Hampshire is that they take this process very seriously. At the same time, demographically, it's not reflective of the United States as a whole, certainly not reflective of the Democratic Party, and I believe that other states should have their chance.
Different solutions have been proposed, like letting more demographically diverse states like Illinois go first. Arguably, voters in other states could also make more informed choices if they had the same opportunity. Another solution is just holding one big national primary so that all states vote at the same time. That would eliminate the outsized influence of voters in New Hampshire and Iowa, but it would make the media and political advertising a lot more influential. Establishment candidates would have a much greater advantage over outsiders because it's easier for them to raise money to spend on advertising. There's also another solution to downplaying the influence of voters in New Hampshire and Iowa. The media could stop paying so much attention. Iowa and New Hampshire have less than 2% of the delegates needed to win the Democratic nomination. It's not the delegates that matter in Iowa and New Hampshire. It's the narrative. Media tend to report on the presidential elections using dramatic logic. They look for winners and losers, treating it as a horse race or a quest, the fellowship of the nomination. The media is incapable of even reporting about the Iowa State Fair without obsessing about which candidate won it. You know who won the Iowa State Fair? 8-year-old Timmy Johnson, who finally convinced his parents to let him go on the pirate ship ride by himself. That's who won the Iowa State Fair. See, not everything has to do with presidential politics. What's that, Shelley? Timmy is using his win at the Iowa State Fair to announce his 2048 presidential campaign? Well, so much for that. Like the Journalism University pointer points out, Iowa and New Hampshire have become about media expectations. And journalists should avoid the temptation to use whatever happens in Iowa to declare a candidate to be finished or to be anointed. Or, we could go back to the whole whoever makes the best TikTok videos wins idea. I really think there's something to that. So what do you think? Do Iowa and New Hampshire have too much of an influence on the primaries? Does the system need to be changed? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching America Uncovered. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.